What's up, everyone? We're back with some more Etheria Restart. Now, we're going to be getting into the PvE tier list that was dropped by the CN fam. This is something I'm actually really excited about because I think it's really important to highlight the differences and the variations that you can have within a community, which I feel like is healthy because, again, we came to find that the Eastern and the Western players, we were playing two totally different games, but we were ultimately getting to the same result, which I think is really cool. So this might be something that could give you, say, another outlook or just another way of looking at the game. I want to shout out Yui and also Agent LS for putting this together and being huge contributors to the community from the very beginning. Appreciate all the hard work you guys are doing, and I expect tons more. So T0, T0.5, T1, T2. This is definitely more of an Eastern format. In the West, we typically use obviously triple S, double S, S, right? But this is something that's actually quite interesting when you're looking at certain aspects of how they like to tier games. And this is something that can make or break whether or not you might invest in something now or later. Keep in mind that a 0 to a 0.5 doesn't necessarily mean it's trash, but there is a reason as to what might make this unit maybe not as valuable as a T0, because maybe there's either a alternate unit you can use that maybe does more damage or does a similar job, or there's something in the game that prevents them from, say, just being an almighty unit. Jumping into T0 here, we have a very interesting lineup. The very first unit we have here is actually Victor. This is an SR unit, and I think by far one of the most slept on SR unit. And what we came to find was that within RTA, anytime you've seen any Eastern opposition, they were using units like Victor. That was something that I thought was really interesting because Victor is a single target damage. And I think one of the things that we typically have emphasized is that if you're really focused on trying to get your PvE together, you want more AoE. But I think also in this type of game, it is also kind of important that if you're looking at it from the format of this is a PvP emphasized game, getting PvP down pat also could be just as important. And then you fill in where you can in PvE, even if you have to do things in the slowest times. Now, Victor actually has a couple of different things, but I think the primary thing that he does that's really important is the fact that he has a passive where it is basically going to allow him to basically increase his damage dealt and then decrease how much damage he takes based off of the amount of HP that he loses. Every 10% HP that he loses, he basically gets a 15% damage dealt increase and a damage reduction of 7%. That can be quite significant when you're talking about anyone trying to get rid of Victor, because he's typically going to probably be a fairly tanky unit, and if you don't kill him right away, you're gonna have some problems. That's kind of what you end up having happen. And the other thing is that with the HP percentage that he loses, he then will gain a shield of 120%, and that will last for 3 turns, which is significantly long. Then with the skill 1, he's also going to be able to deal damage based off of the HP that he has if it's below 40%, and then he will recover 70% of the damage that's dealt. So it's a constant cycle. So the more that you try to basically chip away at this unit, the more, I would say, detrimental your situation can end up being. I really don't think we have any other single target damager that operates anywhere near like what Victor does. And I think that that's something that a lot of people were wondering, like, well, where's all of the single target damage? I think Hoyan has gotten talked about quite a bit, but I think Victor is also an extremely underrated unit. And when you actually start looking at how he does damage and how like potent it is, he can straight up just clear entire comps by himself if he's in the right scenario. And if you make a mistake and say don't cleave him properly, then yeah, you're going to be suffering. That's just how that kind of goes. Hellkid, we talked a ton about Hellkid. I think Hellkid is one of the most oppressive units in the game. Even just in PvE, where you're not actually fixated on other players, he's definitely going to be a top unit. I think for what he does as far as immunity coverage, he then has a ton of damage because of the fact that his Shroud Barrier scales off of his attack. He's constantly going to be hitting hard. Then when you start looking at the fact that he then grants immunity, he's just going to be a really nice layer of extra protection for your entire party, preventing different things that can happen in some runs, like say CCs, which he can basically make your runs and keep your runs smooth. He does have the attack down, so you can decrease how much damage you're intaking. If you build him for this, you can build him to be a CC or stun monster, which I think is one of the things that kind of gets underlooked when you're talking about how you can build him other ways, and it's still quite effective. Now, the next unit that's on here is one that comes to no surprise, which is Lily. I think Lily is definitely one of the very omnipotent, oppressive, light dark units. Well, she is a dark unit, but she is very oppressive. I think one of the things about her, which in my opinion makes her slightly better than Doki Doki, is the fact that she has the constant follow-up or assist that she can bring in an ally with. So I've actually seen quite a bit of pairings with her in like Hellkid, for example. Keep in mind the stun, and that's something where you kind of can manipulate that to where you have a unit that's only doing a single target ability, but now because of the fact that he's able to now say assist with her so often, this is now becoming an ability that almost feels more like it's being AoE'd. With that, she still offers a ton of other utility. She's able to move strike prep. She does increase crit damage. And then on top of that, she also can extend enemy cooldowns and then reset the cooldowns of an ally with the twin trick ability that is her unique ability that she's giving to the ally that she's also having assist. A lot of the times, if there's a certain pairing, if you don't ban pick properly, especially in like a RTA situation, you will just lose. But I also feel like the value of her in PvE is also extremely high because a lot of the things that she does still is allowing her to then still do a pretty significant amount of damage herself, which again is going to be extremely valuable. The fourth unit here that is in T0, I think that this is a unit that again, a lot of people felt like was going to lose value because she no longer has the speed up buff, but I honestly feel like Ling Lao again is beyond meta. Like she is still up there. What exactly is she bringing to the table? Obviously tons and tons of heals, but the other thing that she's also bringing, of course, is immunity coverage, which I think is also like, again, a very important buff that you're not going to be able to build into right away. Like the immunity set is something that you're going to progressively build onto your units, and even getting a pet that has the right stats and all the proper allocations that you might want for removing or dispelling debuffs is just better to prevent debuffs in PvE versus having to deal with them in the first place to remove, because then that can, you know, ultimately change your build altogether. You do have the AoE heal with her, which is just a ton of healing effectiveness, right? So she can heal and extend buffs as well. I think that that's the bigger thing, is that she can extend the buffs. So even though she doesn't have the speed up buff, it definitely does still help that she can extend buffs for your party. It's making her one of the only units, if I'm not mistaken, that can actually do this. And this is something that is going to be an absolutely massive thing if you're using any sort of buff in the game. And so you pair her up with any of these characters, she's just going to have extreme value just because of that. Extension of buffs can be huge and can literally close the gaps between you being able to reset the cooldown completely on your next skill so that you can proc, say, your defense up or your attack up again. Honestly, for the top tier like rankings, I actually do agree with this to some degree. There are some variations that I would say I would consider, but I feel like for what it seems like their approach is, I definitely think that this is a really valuable lineup. T0.5, we have Leon. Leon is the freebie unit that we get in the game. I think one of the things about her is that she is a jack of all trades, and she kind of gives you a ton of value. I feel like, again, from being able to full rotate, offering you a ton of damage with the skill 3, and that's just that one ability. She also then does AoE damage with her skill 2, but if there's only one target, she does a ton of damage with the skill 2, and that's something that I think is like really extremely valuable with her. And of course, on top of that, she's also able to heal herself. I think that that's something that like a lot of people like don't really acknowledge, is that she actually can heal herself, which is something that is really valuable for self-sustain and a character that's able to just kind of keep themselves going without needing another character. So yes, she does have built-in life still, which I think is really, really important. And I think there's a lot of different things that you can do with her, but I think for the simple fact that she can push back strike prep, she can absorb it, you know, obviously doing a ton of damage. I think that's huge. But that's something that I feel like, for what it's worth, it's also kind of like important to remember that Leon's also probably one of the most important units to invest in because of the fact that she has rewards locked behind her. So I think it is good that she's that good, right? Like, I don't think that it's a bad thing, because a lot of people are like, oh, I don't want to build her, but I'm like, dude, she's good. I just also think too, some of this might also be relying upon the build that you end up being able to get on her, which it shouldn't take that long. But again, we also don't know what the actual flow of the game is going to be when it officially releases, so we have to kind of see, because some of these things also might adjust or change based off of that as well. Next up, we have Bealton. Bealton, I think, is definitely an obvious top tier unit. With Bealton though, she does have the revive, but that revive comes with so much more. Not only is it going to allow you to revive, but the other thing is that the Underworld Flower would then also recover HP, I think it's 40%, and then on top of that, it will move their strike prep by 30% or 35%. And so that's something that can be very, very potent when you're talking about turning the tide of any any fight. That is something that can work in PvE. That's something that obviously can work in PvP. And I feel like for what it's worth, like Bealton is definitely a unit that we really didn't have a solution to, like trying to counter even when we're talking about things like PvP. And now we have units like Veronica. But I think when we're just looking at PvE, she's definitely a really solid unit. I think a revive is definitely kind of promoting maybe some slower team comps at that point. Even if you're not going slower, you can still build her a little bit bulkier and still run the damagers you want, and then just make sure that she's able to get that ability off and just bring them back. We also have Tiamat in T0. I think we've had a ton of people from the homie Scion, Vulcan, to a ton of people that actually went through the game with Tiamat and they were clapping the game. I think it's very obvious of how good this unit is. She not only has utility in PvE, but also in PvP, which I think is worth noting. The biggest thing with Tiamat is that she can be built to be bulky, but that bulkiness then converts into how much damage she's able to deal, then also allows her to restore HP back to herself. She gives shields to your entire party. She can AoE taunt. She is an absolute monster. And so I feel like that is something that, even for me, I would put Tiamat in like literally T0. I'm not even gonna lie. Like, she's that oppressive. And I feel like the only time that you might see her really be a T0.5 is true in-game. Like, I'm talking about like max skill ups, max gear. That's gonna take us some time. So I definitely feel like that's not necessarily like 100% going to be the case for her, but I will say I feel like, again, she's still ranked tier like 0.5. That's still high. I'm not going to be a stickler about that. T1, kind of interesting lineup here. Obviously we have Sania, Obel. I'm going to talk about these two together because they're the DOT combo, right? Like I will say I've played every single beta with these two and they're ridiculous. They do amazing work. They can even work in PvP, but I will say that they are queen and kingpin of dot and PvE. The thing is though, is that what you'll come across is that sometimes they don't work. And why is that? Is because there is certain content where in the game DOT does not apply. It does not work. So things like your union boss, certain shell fight, there's certain bosses that DOT just doesn't work. The boss will either be immune to it or it just doesn't land altogether. With that being the case, they are extremely insane in the content that they work in. But if they're not able to land dots, it literally kills majority of their kit. Obel kind of gets away with some things because he's able to essentially stun. So I guess that kind of makes sense there. He has a little bit of, like, I would say more value there. He can also convert buffs. The only problem you have there is that he converts buffs into DOT. And so if buffs can't be, so if you can't land DOT, then you just basically are removing the buff, but there's not any extra action happening, which still kind of kills a portion of his kit. I definitely feel like they aren't the top tier, but I think in terms of PvE, they are still some of the cream of the crop and some of the best units in the game. Now we have Sheada, which I think, again, she was extremely, not even underrated. Like, she went from being extremely powerful, she fell off from grace, and now she's back. I think they actually did do some things to readjust her, so she feels way better than she did in CBT3. And in CBT4, I even used her in the tournament, almost full cleaved the tank down stall comps that were going on with Sheada. Like, she's absolutely insane. But the biggest thing with her, she needs to ramp, right? I think that that's something that is very evident with how you use her. If she doesn't ramp, she's not really effective. You have to have the Soul Flames. That's her passive, where it's going to be giving her an 18% increase on her attack and also a 10% increase on her crit damage, which that will go up 3 times or evolve 3 times. Her AoE is pretty insane because it also procs a defense break. And then on top of that, it will reduce the max cooldown on this ability and then will deal basically 100% more damage. And this is based off of each Soul Flame that she has. That's kind of insane, right? Like, she can hit really, really hard with her ability. Her single target damage is also really good too, because this also could be built into something where you can still buffs constantly. And this is something that also will be increased as she evolves the flame that she's also using. So it's a really interesting gimmick that she uses. I feel like she is, again, back up there. As a T1 unit, I definitely agree with that. Again, she really does have high cleave potency, but you gotta just get her to that point. Especially getting her Soul Flames is going to just make her massively impactful. Now, Messiah is another unit. I think that they've actually brought him back into grace. He fell off a little bit. They did have to adjust him. They obviously made some changes to him, but I feel like he's in the perfect spot now. Obviously, for what it's worth, for what he does, he has the vulnerability, which I think is pretty big. You also have the invincibility, and with the vulnerability, that's a pretty big debuff because that increases damage taken by 30%. That on top of the fact that he can give himself the invincibility, I think that he's actually a really, really good unit. The other thing too with him is that he also has the 50% defense ignore, AoE clearing. He has great single target damage. I think that he's definitely a unit that a lot of people are going to definitely utilize. I know the CN bros love Messiah, but again, I still feel like for initial entry for PvE, this definitely can be a tougher unit for some people to build and to get like through content with. But I feel like if you're able to get lucky and get the proper builds that you need for Messiah, he can actually be quite a impactful unit to your progression. Next up, we have Gray. Gray is definitely one of the top choices for a lot of people in a lot of things. He's going to be one of the best units that you can pick up. That's low investment. He gives you the AoE crit buff. He does have the double up on the turns too. So you could do a defense break, crit buff. Dude is nuts. I definitely say everybody is going to want to build him. I don't see you not building a unit like Gray. He's just going to give you way too much utility. Even one of the top units for Cataclysm, I don't see why you wouldn't build him, to be honest. Kazuya is interesting because she wasn't really emphasized this much, I feel like, on the Western side, but I think her value has definitely been predominantly like renowned for what she does. Sorry, this is Kazumi. This isn't Kazuya. Kazuya is trying to think, that's like a whole nother game. It's Kazumi. It's Kazuyo and Kazumi. So this is Kazumi. But what Kazumi does is she's basically able to reduce cooldown and then she gives a speed up buff. That's something that could be really impactful, especially considering that a lot of the higher ranking characters that you might want to use, you're not going to have full investment on things like skill cooldowns and things of that nature. Even access to like the Codex of Magic isn't going to come right away. So she's a great unit to filter in, especially when you're looking for faster rotations and faster rotations, well, turn rotations and faster rotations on your skills themselves. She's able to contribute to that. She also does have a single target dispel too, so I guess that could be pretty impactful as well. RC77 is one of the underrated units in the game. I actually read his kit in the tournament and I was like, I'm mad I didn't use this guy. Dude does some of everything. He has a stun, defense break, and an attack break all in his skill 3. That's like insane, like absolutely insane. And so this actually makes him pretty good with being able to kind of like say he can stun a single target, then he AoE defense breaks, and then also AoE attack breaks at the same time. So dude has a ton of utility. The other thing is too is that he's also able to extend debuffs, which is another big gimmick. We obviously see Ling Lao with the being able to extend buffs. He can extend debuffs, and also on top of that, he can also push back strike prep every time he hits with his skill 2, which is the same ability that extends debuffs. And then he also has a very unique thing in his kit where his skill 1 can actually increase his accuracy by 50%. Now, this is actually a pretty potent ability, especially in the skill 1, because the thing is that it inherently makes it to where you do not have to build a ton of accuracy on him because he gives himself a 50% accuracy buff. And so with that accuracy buff, it just makes it more likely that he's going to land his debuffs. And so that's something that is huge for a character like this, going up against characters with resistances that are much higher. And even if they don't, but where there might be an accuracy threshold that you can't reach, he's able to give that to himself. So that's actually kind of insane that he's even able to do that. But yeah, RC77 absolutely can. Dorothy the Wisher, she's absolutely insane. I feel like she's definitely a top ranked unit. I feel like where she's tiered is actually like pretty perfect. I feel like what she's able to do, crit rate buff, AoE, life leech, but she can also purify debuffs. So she is a debuff purifier, but it does require her to crit on her skills. It's kind of an interesting gimmick. Some people might be used to this, some might not, but yeah, she needs to crit, and it's not damage critting, it's actually the ability itself critting, and when it crits, it then will increase how many debuffs she will then purify. On top of that, this also applies to her skill 2, which is going to be a crit damage push, as well as then also cooling down the abilities of the target that she's using it on. But if this crits, it will then double the amount of strike prep that you get, which is from 50% to 100%. So she's actually really nasty for rotations. I used her quite a bit in the tournament. She's insane for rotations, absolutely insane, self-sustained with the life leech. So again, you already have characters like Leon that has like an innate built-in life leech, but she can then grant that to her other abilities so that you're restoring even more HP. So the sustain that you can it doesn't directly necessarily mean that you have to have a healer, but it's giving them an ability that is allowing them to essentially do that. Now, also in T0 here, we have Veronica. I think it's worth mentioning that with Veronica, she's definitely one of the units that, in my opinion, for PvP is going to be absolutely insane, but I could see for PvE her being a tier 1. I still think that the buff scaling and being able to, like, say, utilize the soul ward is going to be great for like any of the PvE clearing where people might get stuck. I also feel like she's going to be great in some of the cataclysms as well. And the main thing is that with the soul ward, she's going to be able to reduce and prevent people from going below 1 HP. But then also too, with her being able to then give shield to her entire party, I think that that's also going to help with maintaining, obviously, sustain. But the fact that she's able to still buffs with, and more specifically still unique buffs with the skill 2, that's going to be skill 3, that's actually going to be huge when you're going up against fights like, say, for example, the Hell Kid fight where you have to deal with his Shroud Barrier. She can just steal it. Like, and then GG on that fight, right? She's absolutely insane with that. And again, she's just one alternative for that. But again, it's a very, very seamless and very straightforward ability and gimmick, and it works everywhere. Now, tier 2, again, I think is pretty fair. I think there are some things you do have to consider as far as what I might shift up. Like, units here that I definitely would probably shift up would actually be Heinrich. I feel like Heinrich gives you a lot more utility, especially considering that, like, for some of the hardest difficulties in the game, I definitely would actually shift him up. I feel like, again, the last word with the buff block, with him being able to deal increased damage, you know, as far as being able to crit more often, doing more crit damage to you, I feel like Heinrich is actually really insane. So as far as him being a tier 2, I definitely think that that would be a unit I would personally shift up. Rahu, I do agree with him being a tier 2. He definitely is going to be a progressively better unit as you invest more into him, but he can get the job done. I actually went through this whole CBT with Rahu as my first pick and just trying to test to see how effective he was. Felt like he was pretty solid, not like game breaking, but I definitely felt like he was really good for what he did. He does follow up quite a bit, and if you can get him to that point, he ends up becoming an absolute monster. Now for PvE, I guess that's also kind of what you have to consider. He's not going to be AoE cleaving every single thing, but he does do some pretty nice damage. It does help, right? Chloros, I think the biggest thing to mention about him is that your union battles are going to be pretty significant. That gives you a ton of resources from there, and he's probably one of the best units like there, period. I think for PvE, he definitely shines quite a bit because his gimmick doesn't rely on him necessarily killing. It just relies on a hit counter, and that's where you can see like maybe like units like Ho Yan not being as nearly effective. Because again, she is relying upon killing, where his gimmick is reliant upon actually just hitting multiple times, and every time he uses his S3, he does more damage. So that's like the biggest thing with Chloros. Lilith being in tier 2 is definitely something that I could see as far as a progressive thing. I feel like in the very beginning, she is very effective, and even in PvP, she actually might have a little bit more value, but I could definitely see in PvE where she might be in tier 2. I think like when you start looking at like I would say kind of like the constant damage that she ends up like kind of falling into, and even in some places where her CC stun just doesn't work, that's kind of like the same issue that you'll have sometimes, like we were talking about with DOT, is that her abilities just don't work there, right? She's a high oriented CC, like stun, don't let them get a turn type of monster or unit. And if the opposing team has anything that mitigates that, then she kind of gets cooked in her ability and she just doesn't work effectively, right? So I definitely agree with that. Now, Doki Doki being here in tier 2, I definitely think that Doki Doki has a lot more value in PvP than she does in PvE, but she is still valuable. I would say she can still clear some of the hardest content in the game, or at least be an assistant to doing that. I think the biggest thing with her is the fact that she can purify as many debuffs as she can, which is like all of them. But if you're preventing them in the first place, I could definitely see her not being tiered nearly as high. But again, I still think that she's a extremely valuable unit. The data stream ability that she has is pretty OP because again, that's still giving you extra damage and extra speed outside of the speed up and an attack up buff. So again, still worth mentioning. Kazuyo, I think is actually really good considering that she is the only sleeping AoE unit in the game. I think the biggest thing with her, though, is that there's really no one else to help out assisting with the sleep gimmick. She is the only unit with the passive that makes it to where she does not wake units that are under slumber. But I always look at sleep as a great debuff, because sleep still will make it to where even though you're waking up the target, they still take a increased amount of damage, which is 25%, which is 5% less than erosion. And I think that's because of the fact that the unit technically is slept. So it's technically a stun with a damage increase. So I could kind of see them not making that too like impactful, but 25% more damage is still impactful to some degree, right? So still think that that's pretty huge. Now we also have Kraken as well in T2. Kraken, obviously we seen the homie Tamias go crazy with him in the tournament. He obviously stun locked an entire party, and it just kind of showed his potency. There's a lot of people that are using Kraken. His defense ability for like arena is huge, but in PvE this is also something that can still work. Again, he still will fall into the issue, like same thing with DOT, where there's just some things that just you can't land stuns on. So his abilities just completely get mitigated and he just doesn't work. So that again is a huge thing there. Now, Silence is actually another unit. I think a lot of people were actually asking for her to get buffed, at least from the streams I've done. A lot of people were asking for that. I think really where she kind of falls into a weird spot is like she's not really a master of anything like some of the other characters, but she does still offer attack down, crit rate down, which can still be kind of nice. Again, the Aqua Shield, with it being able to absorb 40% damage, having the 75% of the damage being absorbed, then we'll increase the effect rest, I think by 30%. Still really nice, but I think her S1 is still in a weird spot. The dot, silence, forgetfulness, with it being a 40% chance, and it could just be any of those, where dot just doesn't work in some places. Silence sometimes can work, and oblivion can also sometimes work. I don't feel like she really has a solidified spot yet, but I feel like she still can be effective if you use her a certain way. But nonetheless, I still think that overall she's a solid unit, but maybe just needs some tweaking, right? Now, again, that is essentially the CN Fam's tier list. I feel like for what it's worth, everything that they've kind of like documented here makes sense, right? Like I wouldn't like push back on any of this. I actually feel like, again, the only character I kind of was like surprised he's as low as he is Heinrich. I actually would put Heinrich way higher. I just feel like he offers an account way more value. And I feel like everyone else is honestly tiered pretty well. Honestly, I think again we obviously have like the sleeper units like Victor and stuff like that, but this again hopefully is going to give you guys some more insight on some things that you can actually test and maybe even think about what you might want to do when you start the game. Once again, shout out to Yui and also Agent LS for putting this together. Huge W and contribution to the community. Obviously, we're going to still continue. I'll still have my own personal tier list as we adjust and go throughout the game, because I think that some of these things will evolve into maybe some of these things as well. So we shall see. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. We're keeping the hype train going. I'm really excited because we have a ton more coming with some of your favorite content creators in the game. And we might have some more special things that's coming in the near future. So definitely make sure that you guys like and subscribe to the channel. Once again, everyone, stay blessed, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.